Good day. This is the Corrupt True Crime Podcast, and I'm Charlie Cruz. Today's episode is about one of the most devastating espionage operations in British history. A tale of elite intellectuals, Cold War treachery, and secrets so sensitive they shook the foundations of Western intelligence. We're diving deep into the Cambridge Five, a ring of Soviet spies who burrowed into the highest levels of British government and systematically betrayed their nation's most closely guarded secrets for decades. This is the story of how brilliant minds became traitors, how quantum leaps in scientific knowledge became weapons in enemy hands, and how the unraveling of this conspiracy exposed just how deeply the rot had spread through the British establishment. Picture this. You're running British intelligence operations against the Soviet Union. Your entire job is catching Russian spies. You're personally vetting every agent, reviewing every operation, deciding who gets trusted with the most sensitive secrets in the Western world. You've got the perfect position to protect your country from infiltration. There's just one problem. You're working for Moscow. That was Kim Philby's reality for the better part of 3 decades. And he wasn't alone. He was part of what would become the most devastating spy ring in British history. 5 brilliant men who turned their Cambridge education, their upper-class privilege, and their establishment connections into a weapon against their own country. They didn't do it for money. They did it because they genuinely believed the Soviet Union represented humanity's best hope for the future. And that ideological commitment made them almost impossible to catch. The 30s were a strange time to be young and idealistic at Cambridge University. The world seemed to be choosing sides. Fascism was rising across Europe. The Great Depression had exposed capitalism's failures. Democracy looked weak and ineffective, and the Soviet Union, despite what we know now, appeared to be building something new, something that actually worked. To a certain type of brilliant young student, communism wasn't just politics, it was salvation. Soviet intelligence understood this perfectly. They sent a talent spotter named Arnold Deutsch to Cambridge, an Austrian intellectual who could speak the language of idealistic students. He wasn't looking for mercenaries. He was looking for believers, and he found 5 of them. The genius of the Soviet approach was patience. They didn't want these students to start stealing secrets immediately. They wanted them to play the longest con imaginable. Publicly, distance yourself from communist sympathies, join the establishment, rise through the ranks, become exactly the kind of person who'd be trusted with Britain's deepest secrets. Then, when you're perfectly positioned, that's when you start passing information to Moscow. Kim Philby was the star recruit, son of a famous Arabian explorer, educated at the best schools, charming despite a stutter that somehow made him seem more trustworthy. He'd been openly sympathetic to communism as a student, even traveling to Vienna to help socialists fighting fascists. But after his recruitment, he made a show of moving rightward politically, joined the Anglo-German Fellowship, appeared to abandon his radical phase. Then he applied to British intelligence. They welcomed him with open arms. Guy Burgess was the complete opposite flamboyant, openly homosexual when that was still illegal, a heavy drinker with no filter between brain and mouth. He was so outrageous that he seemed impossible as a spy. Who would trust someone that visible, that unreliable, with sensitive information? That was exactly the point. His obvious flaws became camouflage. Plus, the thinking went, a gay man couldn't be blackmailed about his sexuality if everyone already knew. Perverse logic, but it worked. Donald MacLean had the perfect establishment pedigree. Tall, handsome, high-achieving, son of a liberal politician. He sailed into the Foreign Office and started climbing toward positions with access to the most sensitive Anglo-American intelligence sharing. He struggled with alcohol and had troubling episodes that should have raised red flags. They didn't. Anthony Blunt was the aesthete, sophisticated art historian. Impeccable taste, moved in royal circles. During the war, he worked for MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence service. Later, he became surveyor of the Queen's pictures. You couldn't get more establishment than that. Nobody suspected the man cataloguing royal art of photographing state secrets for Stalin. John Cairncross was the odd man out. Working-class Scottish background, brilliant linguist, didn't quite fit the Oxbridge mold, but he had something the Soviets desperately wanted: access to Bletchley Park, where British codebreakers were decrypting German military communications during the war. The intelligence he passed about German troop movements possibly influenced the Battle of Kursk, one of the war's turning points. Here's the thing about being a Soviet spy at the highest levels of British intelligence. The actual spycraft isn't that complicated. You've got legitimate access to the documents. You can remove files from the office because you're supposed to be working with them. You photograph them. You return them. Nobody notices because you're trusted. Philby had a handler he'd meet in London safe houses, sometimes dead drops in Park's classic tradecraft, chalk marks signaling when a drop was loaded. McLean, working in the British Embassy in Washington with access to atomic energy intelligence, had even easier methods: diplomatic pouches, direct handler contact. The Soviets treated him like the gold mine he was, and the British class system made it all possible. These were Cambridge men, old-school ties, gentlemen, the kind of people who'd been running the empire for generations. The idea that they'd betray their country was almost unthinkable. That assumption was their greatest asset. For years, it worked perfectly. Philby rose to become head of Soviet counterintelligence for MI6. Think about that. The department specifically tasked with catching Soviet spies was being run by one. He could see every operation Britain was planning against the USSR. He could identify every British agent Moscow needed to worry about. He could protect Soviet intelligence by sabotaging operations before they started. The Soviets were reading Britain's playbook in real time. Then, American and British codebreakers started making progress on something called the V-No-Na project. They were attempting to decrypt Soviet intelligence communications from the 40s, messages the Soviets thought were completely secure. Turns out, they weren't. Partial breaks in the encryption started revealing code names, biographical details, bits and pieces of information about Soviet agents operating inside the British government. One codename kept appearing: Homer. And the details surrounding Homer pointed to someone in the British Embassy in Washington during a very specific time period. Someone whose pregnant wife had traveled to New York at a particular moment. Someone with access to atomic intelligence. The circle of suspects narrowed, and it kept narrowing until it pointed directly at Donald McLean. MI5 began surveillance. They were building a case, getting ready to make their move. But they made one critical mistake. They didn't move fast enough, and they didn't account for the fact that the spy ring was a network, not just individuals. Kim Philby, sitting in Washington as MI6's liaison to American intelligence, got word that McLean was about to be arrested. He had to warn him, but he couldn't do it directly without exposing himself, so he used Guy Burgess, who was conveniently living with Philby in Washington, a connection that would later seem blindingly obvious. Burgess traveled to London supposedly on other business. He immediately contacted McLean, and on a Friday evening, the two of them simply vanished. They took a ship to France, then disappeared completely. Days later, British intelligence realized they'd defected to the Soviet Union. The establishment was stunned. Two diplomats, Cambridge-educated, impeccable credentials, had fled to Moscow. It was unprecedented. It was humiliating. And immediately, suspicion fell on the person who'd warned them, the person Burgess had been living with in Washington, Kim Philby. They hauled him back to London, interrogated him, and Philby charming, stuttering, seemingly vulnerable Philby denied everything. He admitted being friends with Burgess, but claimed complete shock at the defection. The establishment desperately wanted to believe him. He was one of them. Harold Macmillan, the Foreign Secretary, actually cleared him publicly in Parliament, but British and American. The thing about brilliant schemes is that they are seldom brilliant enough, and no matter how clever you are, the house almost always wins. Now, if you enjoyed our show, tap that follow button and 5 stars in our ratings. Catch you next time.
Grab news. Thomas.